elegant natural edge bowl, and I have some slides. If we could put up the slides, yeah. There we go. Okay, that's my website there at the top. Websites are kind of like children; you can ignore them for a while, and then they want money. Yeah, so it's a work in progress. You know, it's never done, but I'm making progress, updating my site. So you can go out there, you can see some of my work on my website. Next slide, please. Okay, so today's topic is natural edge bowls. Oh, that's kind of weird. Okay, there we go. and typically, when wood turners, especially beginners, when you start working with beginners and you're talking about natural edge bowls, the picture here is a bowl that Don Geiger turned. I didn't get Don's permission to use this slide, but hopefully he's okay with it. We're pretty good friends. I think he'll be all right. So this is, I kind of think of these as being more rustic, and not rustic in a bad way, not good or bad rustic, but just in a interior design type of way. I have the definition of rustic. It says, relating to the countryside, or constructed or made in a plain and simple fashion. So they're plain, simple, they're kind of low. And I was doing a lot of these at one point in time. I really liked them. But the thing about this style natural edge bowl is everybody photographs, displays them in pretty much that orientation. So from the side view, where you can see the top wings are on the left and the right. And it turns out if you turn it 90 degrees and you look at it, it looks really, really funny. And so my original thought was, how can I do a natural edge bowl where I can look at it in any orientation and feel like it's a pleasing shape? If you look at these from the end, they're just kind of a blah, kind of a hump kind of shape. So that was the original idea, was how can I do this in a way where there's no orientation to it? Because, you turn a salad bowl, you can turn it in any orientation. It looks pretty much the same because it's round all the way around. So these aren't round all the way around. Next slide, please. So I attended a workshop. It was the master class taught by David Ellsworth at the Anderson Ranch Art Center. I think it was in 2010. And it was a really nice experience. If you ever get a chance, I highly recommend going there. It's a beautiful facility, and David is a wonderful instructor. And so we start out the week doing salad bowls, flat rim bowls. And he had us do like a very kind of low, flat bowl. And then the next one, he wanted us to make it a little bit taller and a little bit taller, kind of working up from the low, flat kind of thing to more tall, upright. And then we moved into doing hollow forms. So about the third day, I was on the end of the building, and I could see where the wood lot was, and the shop manager's name was Jason, and he did all the chainsaw work. And I saw David walk out and kind of sit down next to this log, and he sat and studied this log for about 10, 15 minutes or so, and then it's like he got the idea, and he ran and he got Jason, and he had him cut the blank for him, and that's the piece he turned from it. And so to me, this was kind of a light bulb moment. This is like, to me, that was so elegant. I mean, this thing, it has the little notch on the side where there was like a limb or something coming out, and it has all the undulations, and he took the bark off of it, which I thought was kind of nice. And I can kind of envision making like chopsticks and having these long chopsticks kind of settled into the little groove from the little scoop out where the limb was. And so that was this and the other thing was kind of the inspiration for this, trying to make these elegant natural edge bowls. And so the definition of elegant is pleasingly graceful and stylish in appearance or manner, okay? So next slide, please. Okay, so then following along with the interior design, it's not a great picture, I apologize for that, but this is like an upscale New York loft apartment. It's very open, very airy, very light, very, very modern, the furniture and the fixtures in the apartment are very, very modern. So my thinking is, how can I make a piece that would look like it's very suiting, very well, very, very at home in this setting? So next slide. And then on the flip side of that, the rustic ones, the first one I showed you, to me would be more at home. This is like a hunting cabin, right? So lots of leather, lots of wood, lots of stone. So that fits in with that simplistic rustic style. So this is kind of my line of thinking for how I'm going to design these pieces. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is another kind of hunting lodge picture. Next slide. And then back to, this is another kind of upscale, elegant. This one is a little bit more on the gaudy, side of things. So the question is, can you turn a natural edge bowl that would look like it's at home in this very upscale, fancy, elegant apartment? So that's kind of the challenge, right? Okay, next slide. Okay, back to the piece. This is, again, the piece that David turned that was kind of the inspiration for that. Next slide. And this is one that I turned after seeing David's. So again, a little bit more of the upright. Still has some of those rustic qualities to it. I left the bark on it. The bark survived, so I left it on there. There was a couple of places where it chipped off, but that was, I think that was either some kind of ash or some kind of Russian olive or something. So it had very thick bark that was kind of fun to work with. So it has some of the elegant qualities, but then again, it has some of the rustic qualities. And you can see it's the orientation, it's almost to this left-hand side of the piece, where if you look at it from that side, it's not really a very pleasing shape. But if you look at it where the high point and the high point are perpendicular to you, it's very pleasing. So that was kind of my first attempt. Next slide, please. And then that same week, probably the next one, or maybe two pieces later, this was one that I turned, and I feel like this one is much closer to that idea. So it has the really wild undulations with the high side, and then the left side is higher than the right side. So starting to come into an idea that sort of evolved out of this. So instead of trying to have it where it looks good in all orientations, now I'm thinking, okay, there's really one orientation that it would look good, and it's almost like a shirt collar. So it has like two high sides and then kind of a low side and then a very low side. So you would always want to display this piece. When you put it on a shelf or something, you would always want to put it in this orientation, so it has a front, it has a back, it has a left, it has a right. So now I'm kind of away from getting it to look good in 360 degrees. I want it to look good in one orientation. Okay, next slide, please. So again, this is some Chinese tallow that grows up in the Pensacola area. We used to get a lot of that stuff. And it's a strange wood to work with. It's an invasive species, very fast growing, kind of like the stuff over there, I think. And the day you cut it, it's white. I mean, almost as white as holly. And then it starts to develop this staining. It's almost like a blue stain like you'd see in pine or some other species. So if you catch it right, this staining will eventually take over the whole piece, and then it turns like this really muddy, brown, ugly color. But if you catch it just right, you can get some really nice contrast between the dark and the light. So I caught it. So you have this whole thing going on with the different colors of the wood. It's not heartwood, sapwood. It's like staining, this invading the log. And then you have the really cool undulations. And again, this is the orientation of the piece. So you have the low side, which is facing you. You have the back, which is a little bit higher, but not so high. If you turned it the other orientation, you wouldn't even see the back of the piece because it would, the front of it would block. And then you have the kind of cool undulations, and you got that one little piece of bark like sticking out. So this one to me is getting closer to that idea. I mean, I can almost see this in that apartment I showed you earlier. Next slide, please. And again, this is the same wood. This one was turned earlier, before the staining started happening. This one had a little bark inclusion. It has like a little bit of a crotch figure in the front. But again, so this is the orientation of the piece. There's really no other orientation that would make sense. We put it on the shelf. This is the way you put it. And you have some really wild things going on. Next slide, please. And this is a series that I did out of some oak that I had. And again, trying to evoke this idea of elegance in the pieces. So that's all the slides. That was fairly painless, I think. Anybody have any questions before we? I know you start talking and you start showing pictures, and a lot of people just immediately nod off. So I try to make it short and quick. But I do want to set kind of the set a foundation, set a base to start from. But anybody have any questions on anything that I've shown you so far? Okay, well, I'm going to go to the lathe, and we're going to start with the turning to try to turn one of these pieces. And I acquired some poplar from one of our members at the GAW club, and I brought it with me. That was going to be the blank I turned, but Frank offered for me to cut some wood out of his yard, and he had some nice rosewood, so we quickly cut a blank of rosewood, and I think it's going to turn pretty nicely. But I like to do the planning up front. I mean, I want to kind of take in from that inspiration from David Ellsworth, who just very purposefully went out to the log yard, sat, and searched and scanned that log to find exactly the spot he wanted to cut it from and the orientation that he wanted to put it on the lathe. So I want to be very, very determinate in the same way. And I want to line it up on the pith. These, in my opinion, when you look down in the bottom of the bowl, you get the cool little oval shapes. And if it's off center, it really throws everything off. It just messes, messes with your eye. You look in the piece and everything's kind of shifted over. So I want the bottom of the piece to be lined up on the pith. So I'll actually draw a line where the pith is on both ends and then connect the line. Okay, so that's the first step, is to draw that line down where the pith is. And then I just want to balance, for the purposes of this demo, I want to get things going quickly, so I just want to balance it equal sides. So I just take my pencil, and my whole philosophy in turning is just keep it simple, okay? So yeah, you could do a ruler, you could do all kinds of jigs or whatever, but I just take a pencil, hold my fingers on the pencil, stick it where that line is, turn it around end for end, and stick it on there, and they line up pretty close. So that's the center part of the bottom of the log. There it is. There's like a delay. That's cool. Okay, that was fun. Okay, and then on the top, I'm just going to try to get it where it turns nicely. So we'll bring this up. It's always fun to come and turn on a strange lathe in front of strange people. Keeps you on your toes, right? Yes. Yes. All right. Well, we won't be strangers by the end of the night, right? All right, so tighten it up. And so I want to just a couple of checks. So I've actually cut below the pith. I don't want to actually include the pith in the piece, but you could if you wanted to. I've done these where I had more of like a limb and I wanted a taller piece. So actually about 1/3 up from the bottom, I had the pith. So if you wanted to do a taller piece from a smaller log, you could. But when you do include the pith in your pieces, then you have to deal with some weird warpage that may or may not happen, some cracking that usually happens around the pith. So you introduce some other issues. You could introduce some other issues. So just to avoid all that, I'm going to exclude the pith. So when I turn this and then do the tenon, the bottom of the tenon will probably be right there where just above where the pith is. So that gives me room. That gives me room to make a tall piece right above the pith and still have room to make the tenon. All right, everybody understand? Okay. Sometimes I explain things and don't really make a point of what I'm trying to explain. So if I do that, just let me know. All right, so what I'm seeing now, I've got the pith here where my pencil is. So I'm going to take the pencil and put it there, spin the piece, and I'm way off. I'm about 1/4 inch off. So what I'm going to do, I want to keep this point here, but I want to lower this side just a little bit to try to balance that pith out a little bit. So I want the pith to be pretty much equal. Okay, and then let's see what it does on the top. So again, I'm going to move my rest over here. I'm going to spin it end for end. Just put my thumb here for a reference. So here it's there, and this is way. So move it a little bit. And I know when you move it one way, it throws things off the other way. So this gives me a more balance. But what I'm doing is just kind of shifting things back and forth. And what I can do is I can balance it where the high sides are even with each other, or I can make one side a little bit higher than the other side. And then you can do the same thing with the low side. It'll be a little bit easier once we round it on the lathe a little bit. But by shifting the thing around between centers, you can tailor that look exactly the way you want it. So you can get those profiles where maybe it's a little higher here, it's lower here, it's got that shirt collar kind of effect. And that all comes from just making little minor adjustments on the lathe. Anybody have any questions on that step? Okay. And to me, these are the very minor, simple steps, but this is the orientation of the piece, and so this really affects what you're going to end up with in the end more than a lot of the other things we're going to do tonight. Okay, so get it good and tight. Make sure it's tight. And again, I didn't take the spur drive out, and I didn't beat on it. That really kind of makes me cringe when I see people beating on. You have a really nicely machined number 2 Morse taper, and then somebody takes it and sticks it on a piece of wood and starts whacking at it, and lots of bad things can happen. You can mushroom the end of the thing, and then you stick it in your spindle, and it can jam in the spindle, and so please don't do that. All right, so now we're spinning, we're tight, we're not going to come loose. This bark is probably not going to survive because it's kind of falling off now. You may intimately get to know some of this bark. All right, so I'm going to start off with the bowl gouge. This is a 5/8 inch bowl gouge. My jig at home is a little bit different than Frank's jig, so that's why you see kind of a double bevel there. Just ignore that. But this is the grind that most people attribute to David Ellsworth. David didn't invent the grind. He's the one that came up with the jig to help you sharpen the grind at home, so it's pretty much attached his name to it. There's fingernail grind, swept-back grind, Irish grind. There's lots of different names for it. There's other ways to grind it other than using David's jig. So, but it's a very effective grind. Beginners are it's very easy for beginners to pick up. And I should have said earlier, I've done a lot of teaching, demonstrating. When I lived in Pensacola, I would drive over to Mobile once or twice a month, and I would teach classes at the woodcraft store there. So I've done quite a bit of teaching with beginners. So if you're above a beginner level, hopefully there'll be something in this for you. So all right, so we're going to start out with what we refer to as the roughing cut. And then there's the ABC of wood turning, and that's the anchor, bevel, cut. And I've always heard that was attributed to Norm Rose. I don't know if Norm invented it or what, but everything I've ever heard was that was Norm Rose's baby. So I always give credit to Norm. Rest in peace. He was a great guy if you didn't know him. So anchor, bevel, cut. We want the tool at the roughing cut, you want the tool to be horizontal. Okay, so what that's going to do is going to make all of the forces that are coming from the wood and the lathe go into the tool rest and then into the lathe and not into you. So you want those forces on the lathe and not you. because otherwise you're going to be fighting it. It's going to be jarring you. It's going to be like working on doing bad things to your shoulder socket. So we just ease the tool. You want the flute pointed in that direction. And you notice I'm turning left-handed. I'm not a left-hander. I just don't like the shavings to come into my shirt and into my person. We'll work up the speed here. There we go. Now we're talking. I'm not going to do the Jimmy Clues thing and turn it to 11. So we're just going to start. We're going to start at the corner here, knocking off the corner. So I really have kind of 3 goals in mind. I want to get it round. I want to get it trued up. I want to put a tenon on it. And I want to do the third thing that I can't remember. I'll remember it in a minute, I promise. So the thing about natural edge bowls is you end up turning a lot of air. Okay, so you notice when I first started this cut, you can hear it going tick, 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 tick. So that's wood, air, wood, air, wood, air. And then as I got into the cut, everything kind of settled down and I started removing a lot of material. So you're going to do that quite a bit with this type of turning. And as we get into the cut, then I can start to drop the handle into more of a slicing cut instead of the roughing cut, which is, it's going to be a little bit better cut as far as like creating tear out. Which we want to avoid creating tear out. Because tear out is what makes you have to sand and sand and sand and use heavier and heavier grits of paper. So what happened is it slipped a little bit, which it's bound to happen when you have the spur drive, which kind of turns itself into a really crappy Forstner bit. So if you get a little heavy cut or a little catch, it'll start to slip. So when that happens, you could drill a hole. You could take a hammer and chisel off an area. Get rid of that bark, because the bark kind of starts to come loose, and that's really where it slips, is where the bark is. What else can you do? You can use like a big Forstner bit to make a big area where there's no bark. Now don't beat the thing in. That's bad. But usually, this is a pretty big spur drive, so it's going to grab pretty well. Okay. Now the slides that I showed you, a few of the pieces had bark and a few of them did not have bark. To me, the hallmark of the natural edge bowl is not whether or not you can save the bark. To some people it is. Some people will go to the extremes of like using CA glue to glue the bark on, and just extreme measures to save the bark. To me, if it stays on through the turning and it looks nice, then I'll keep it. If not, then I like to strip it off and maybe do some coloring or some burning or something where the bark is. All right. Good idea, especially when you're doing these pieces, to make sure it's going to spin and not hit the rest before you turn the lathe on. Because I've lost a few by not doing that. All right. All right, I'm going to go ahead and flatten off the bottom. That's the third thing, flatten the bottom. All right, so So I kind of got that started. I'm going to turn around and cut in the other direction. Move my rest over a little bit. Anytime the tool doesn't cooperate with you, it's good to kind of back off, maybe readjust the rest, evaluate what you're doing, figure out why that cut is not going the way you want it to go. Don't just keep blindly pushing the tool into the wood. Okay, that's a good flat area for the tenon. So right now I'm just going to make sort of a rough tenon, and I'll come back and refine it in a bit. So this is a scraping cut. It's the roughing cut, but I'm using it more in just a pushing it straight forward kind of manner, just to go straight in. And I'm going to make it a good strong quarter, maybe even 3/8. And I'll stop there. So I'll come back and measure it and refine the tenon in a minute. So the next cut I'm going to make, I like to call it the secondary tenon. Other people have other names for it, like base cut, but basically you're just giving yourself some extra wood to work with. You may not have chuck jaws that are the size related to the base. So if you have a bigger piece of wood, you want a bigger set of chuck. You want a bigger chuck and bigger set of jaws to hold that wood on the lathe. But you may have jaws that are too big for the base, and that's one very common mistake I see with new turners is they put it in the lathe, put it in the chuck, and then that tenon kind of becomes the base of the piece. And I don't want to have any evidence of how it was turned, and I want the ability to make the base any size or any shape that I want to. So by leaving a little extra wood, I can make that into a foot, or I can completely round it over. I can make it any size that I want. And so that cut is going to be the same series of cuts, and it's going to look like another tenon, basically. Okay. So somewhere in those two tenons, we're going to come down, we're going to shape the bottom of the piece, and it's going to end up in here. Now, anybody have any questions on that? Okay, good. Good, we're doing good, no questions. So now I'm going to switch over to the other side, and I'm going to work it from top down. And the reason I do that is if I can, the area where there's bark, and potentially where I'm trying to save the bark and leave the bark on the piece, if I cut in the direction to help hold it down, it has a better chance of staying on. If I cut in from right to left, where I'm standing, it's going to tend to pull it up. Okay, so if the tool's going in this direction, we're pulling in that way. If we're going in that direction, we're kind of pushing it down. So we're going to be, trying to push the bark back into the piece rather than lift it off of the piece. And most of the time, I will obey that rule. Sometimes I will break that rule. But even if you're not trying to save the bark, even if there's no bark there, when you make that cut all the way off the end of the piece, you tend to lift off some fibers, and you can actually see like stray fibers, like the piece that we saw earlier today. I'll tell you about that later. But anyway, we want to cut in this direction, basically. Okay, so now, basically what I was doing before, I had it like this. Now I'm going to turn it like this. So this is right-handed turning, and I'm going to go in this direction. So kind of alternating between roughing cut and slicing cut. All right. Oh, wow. We may need to switch the belts. Now, can you see now I'm starting to, well, you can't really see from there, but right now I'm starting to develop that shape. Right. Shape that I'm going for, which in a lot of ways, I like to think of this shape as an egg. You know, you think like you crack an egg and you break it open and you get some wild kind of undulations in the shell and it kind of tapers down. And so an egg, or at least a chicken egg, has a big end and a small end, most of them. And so when I'm doing these, I'm thinking, okay, this is the big end of an egg. And that's what I'm visualizing in my head, you know, the big end of an egg. Or if I want it to really taper down small, I'll do like the small end of an egg. And I do want to get this completely round. So now I'm up to right here. This is where I've cut. Haven't cut this area yet. Okay, so I need to make a couple of more cuts. And so from this point, this is looking more like the rustic style that I showed you in the beginning. So to make it sort of that more upright, more tall, more elegant style, I'm going to have to take off a little bit more of the diameter of the piece to get those proportions a little bit better. All right, so just down here. And this is why I don't like to turn right-handed, because everything's coming right up in my face. All right, speaking of proportions, Frank gifted me with this handy dandy, really cool proportionator. I don't know what it's really called, but I think I'm going to coin that term. Fibonacci, the golden mean, the golden ratio, 2/3, 1/3. It's not actually 2/3, 1/3, but it's close enough. And this thing, it turns out, you can do some wild stuff with it. So it's like your eyeballs and your chin and the top size of your face. It's like your fingers and your palm. Oh, it goes this way. Your fingers and your palm. It's like everything on your body and in nature has something to do with this. Why? I have no idea. But it turns out, if you do your pieces and your pieces fit into this, they are very pleasing to the eye. So there's something magical about this ratio that is kind of hardwired into our brains. So something to think about when you're trying to design a piece. All right. I don't know about brain science or whatever, but to me it's just fascinating. I should talk about safety too. So when I'm at home, I have dust mask. I have a dust collection system going. Most of the time I wear a full face shield. It's very hard for me to communicate with you. It's even harder for me to communicate with you when I'm wearing like this big plastic massive thing in front of my face. And this is a pretty small piece of wood. So I feel pretty confident, 80% confident that I'm not going to hurt myself with this piece of wood. 75% confident that I'm not going to hurt you with this piece of wood. But when you're at home, please follow safety protocols. Use your dust collection, use your face shield. And a lot of these techniques I'm doing where I'm not standing in the line of fire while I'm turning it. I don't know how many times I've turned pieces with bark on it, and all of a sudden you hear something go thunk on the other side of the room, and it's a big chunk of bark that's flown off. So that happens. Yeah. I'm sure some of you guys were at the Florida Symposium when Ed took the chunk of wood to the face. That was frightening. If you don't know that story, get somebody to tell you. All right. All right, so again, we're still working on rounding this up. All right. So if I say uphill turning and downhill turning, how many of you know what the heck I'm talking about? Okay, a couple. Good. That's good. So when you're doing spindle turning, the instructor, if you're working with an instructor, will normally drill you on turning downhill. So that turning downhill, which is physically like from the larger diameter to the smaller diameter. So you are really, as you turn the wood, you're creating a little hill, and your tool is going down the hill. And the reason it works that way is in spindle turning, the fibers are running this way, parallel with the lathe. So as you cut this fiber, it's supported by that fiber. And as you cut that fiber, it's supported by this fiber. So it's like petting a cat in the proper direction. When you pet the cat in the wrong direction, hair all stands up funny. So the wood is kind of like cat fur, right? So when you turn the orientation 90 degrees, so now the grain is running perpendicular to the lathe. Well, that turns that whole downhill concept on its head. So now the turning downhill is actually going up the hill that you're creating. So you're actually going from smaller diameter to larger diameter. And then when you go into the interior, so if you're doing like a cup or a goblet in your spindle turning, then it's the opposite. You're going to go from smaller diameter to larger diameter. When you're hollowing a piece that's in-grain piece, face grain piece, then you're going from the larger diameter to the smaller diameter. Everybody follow that? I know there was a lot of gibberish there, but looks like most people are tracking with me. Okay, so at this point, everything is round. I got a little bit of tear out here. It's not horrible. And we're going to take off another probably 1/8 or 1/4 inch of diameter. So we have enough wood left that I'm going to be able to clean all that up. I'm going to make a couple of cuts right here. And I'm going to come back and fix up the tenon. And then we're going to turn it, put it in the chuck. And then when I do the chuck thing, we'll take maybe like a 5-minute break, and I'll change out the belt so I can get a little bit more RPM. And we're doing great on time. Might get out early. All right. Anybody have any questions before I carry on? Okay. All right, so we'll carry on again. Roughing cut. And so hopefully now you can start to see where we're having this little extra material at the base of the piece is going to give me the more options for the base. All right. All right, so that's good. So 2 out of the 3 goals are now accomplished. And we're going to move to the third. This, my friends, is a Vic Mark chuck. This is the Cadillac of chucks. I personally can't afford a Cadillac, so I don't have one. But my friend Frank, there he is, probably has about 10 of them. But he rolls that way. All right, no, it's a very nice chuck. So it's completely encased. So you don't get like junk up inside it, so it's not going to mess up your gears. You got a nice hex socket thingy thing, Allen wrench thing. So if you lose the thing that came with it, you can just go get an Allen wrench and stick it in there. So you're not out the thingy thing, the tightener thing. The only downside that I hear from Frank is that sometimes, so the chuck body has the insert threaded into it. So sometimes you thread it onto the lathe and you really torque it on there, and then when you go to take the chuck off, you get the chuck off, but the insert stays on the lathe. Well, I have a really old Supernova chuck, and the same thing happens with it. So it's not unique to the Vic Mark. But if you can afford one, by all means, please. All right. The cool thing, oh, you shouldn't have moved the camera, sorry. That was my bad. There we are. Here we go. Okay. So the way they make these, there's two styles of jaw. I'm talking about the jaws for the chuck. There are dovetail jaws, which pretty much everybody makes. And then the guys at One Way came up with this idea of shark teeth, serrated, I don't know what they're called, but it's like a different style jaw. And some people really like those, and some people don't. There are pros and cons to either one. My preference is dovetail because you make the shape of the tenon and the shape of the jaws work with each other in conjunction or symbiotically, whatever. And it really locks itself into the chuck, onto the lathe, and you don't get vibration. The one-way style, the shark teeth serrated jaws, don't do that quite as well, in my opinion. But there are advantages with those. If you want to just chuck a square piece, those work much better. And there are some other advantages. But I'm partial to the dovetail. But the way they make these is this was like a circular disc of metal, and then they cut it. Right, so that's why the jaws are numbered, because they were originally, this is where they were originally in the metal before it was 4 pieces, when it was 1 piece. It's 1 piece of metal, and then they cut it and make 4 pieces. So because it was 1 piece, and they made 4 pieces out of it, it was originally a circle. Okay, approximately there. So we got to give room for whatever kind of cutter they use to cut it. So that's your circle right there. If you made the tenon that size, you would get full contact all the way around. If you open it up a little bit, you start to get less contact. And the more you open it, you get to a point where you're really only touching here, 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 here. All right, and then so you overcome that by tightening it. But there's a point where it's just too big, okay? So you're only really touching on 8 points. So what I'm trying to tell you is you want to, as a rule of thumb, you want to have about a 1/4 inch gap, maybe 3/8 inch gap. If you're going to rough turn a piece and then let it dry and then come back and true it up and then return it later, you want to make it more closer to like 3/8. That way, when it warps, you'll have enough wood left to true it up. But if you're going to go straight start to finish like I'm going to go on this one, then you want to shoot for more like a 1/4 inch. And that way, when I get it in there and I start tightening it, I'm getting closer to that full contact, full 360-degree contact. Okay, and that's going to be the best, most secure way to hold this piece in the chuck on the lathe. Okay, the other way, the other strength of the joint is actually the wood itself. So the shoulder here is very important when I turn this tenon area. Very important to get it nice and flat where I get full contact with the top of the jaw. And I don't want to make the tenon so tall that the tenon bottoms out in these jaws. So if it bottoms out in these jaws, you're going to have a gap there. You can't have a gap, because if you have a gap, then you're going to get vibration and you get movement. And you get vibration and movement, and you blow up the piece. All right, that was a lot to take in. Everybody, anybody questions? Everybody understood that? Okay, good. So back to my keep it simple method. I take a pair of these calipers that are outside calipers. Yes? Outside? Okay. I always get inside and outside mixed up. I don't know why. So outside calipers, measure it. And now I'm going to come over here, turn the lathe on. I'm going to make a pencil mark. And then I'm going to measure my pencil mark. And that's right on the money. I could not be more on the money. I'm like so on the money I should go buy a lottery ticket. Okay, so now I entertain myself a lot of times. You know. My oldest daughter is kind of taking up that trait. She just tries so hard to be funny. And it gets obnoxious, like how obnoxiously hard she's trying to be funny. And I know she gets that from me. So just have to bear with me. Laugh at me if you can't laugh with me. All right. So we go to the line. All right, so we went to the line and I did that push and cut. And now, so since I started blabbering and turning, I've only used one tool. I'm about to switch tools. And the tool I'm going to switch to is this tool here. And some guys in the club will call this thing a skew chisel. And other guys in the club, like me, will call it a negative rake scraper. So a skew chisel is a very delicate instrument. It's very, very sharp, and you do very fine, delicate spindle turning. You can do little beads with it. You can do planing cuts with it. Negative rake scraper is just a tool where you can just shove it in and hope the wood flies off. So my point is that I'm not really using this tool the way it's designed to be used. But it's a very convenient tool to turn a tenon with because of this right here, the hand wheel. The hand wheel on a lathe is always like in this orientation. It's always like at the end of the tool rest. And it's always in the way. So if I'm a beginner and it's not in the way with this one, but most, if it was like 1 inch longer, it'd be in the way. So trust me, it's in the way, all right? So if I'm a beginner and I hand you this tool and I tell you to turn this tenon, this is in the way, so I have to move the handle out, and then I'm going to push it at the line. I'm going to push it in at an angle. There's no other way to do it. So when I first started teaching and we were doing tenons, I discovered that. And it's been like the greatest teaching aid ever, and I don't have to do anything because the lathe manufacturer did it for me. So bottom line is we're going to push it in at a slight angle. And it's usually about like how far you have to move the handle away from the handle of the tailstock. So we're just going to push it. And I took away most of my pencil line. And that was a very extreme form of a dovetail. And there is some angle of this dovetail that matches this. And they even make a turning tool where you can stick that tool there and like it turns the right angle for you. I usually don't recommend buying that tool because I don't like to have people spend money they don't need to spend. Some people, are inclined to do that. Some people aren't. So I'm just going to reposition the tool here and make it just a little bit less of an angle. But you want a really nice clean cut. You don't want a lot of tear out here. You want a nice flat area here. Okay. So what I've got here is a nice flat area here and a nicely turned tenon with very little tear out. And that's going to give us the best chance to get this wood in the chuck on the lathe without coming off. All right, so I'm going to redo my secondary tenon now that I have a real tenon in place. And I'm just going to return this part right here. Because that area right here is, when I put it in the chuck, it's just very difficult to turn because the chuck is kind of in the way. So I'm going to kind of get that out of the way now while it's in this orientation. You don't want to do too much turning after you've put the chuck on. earlier it was slipping, right? So if I did something and I made it slip and I tighten it back up, it's not going to go back in the same orientation. So then I've caused a point of misalignment. When I put it in the chuck, it's not going to run true. I mean, sometimes it runs close to true, but inevitably there is some run out or wobble. All right. So at this point, I would like to. All right, I'm going to switch to the other belt. Frank's going to come help me. All right, here we go. There we go. This is just going to give me just a few more RPMs to work with. If I could do it. I think I got it, Frank.
There's a handle.
Yeah, I got the handle.
Okay.
That was easy. That was surprisingly easy. Good job. Thank you. Thanks for your assistance. All right. Handy dandy. Turn this back down to 0. Got to get this thing out. This is a good time to tell a joke. I'm more of a jokester than a joke teller. And I was doing a demonstration one time, and I was lamenting the fact, because we had like a little lull. We were doing something, I forget, where I wasn't going to be talking for a minute or two, or I wasn't going to be actively doing something for a minute or two. And I said, man, I really wish I had some jokes to tell. And for the next 6 months, about once a week, somebody in the audience emailed me jokes. And it got to the point where I finally had to tell them to quit. I'm like, I really appreciate your jokes, but you have to stop now. All right, there we go. Yes. Okay. Yes. All right, so I want this on. I don't want this on so much that it's going to make the insert stick, but I want a good solid connection. I want metal to metal here. A lot of you guys use the coffee can lid circle nylon washer thingy. Don't do that, please, because you're going to cause vibration. It's going to get loose on you. Bad things can happen. I'm not going to use the tailstock anymore. If this piece of wood were bigger, I would. But I feel pretty confident that this is going to stay in there and I can work with it and not have to worry about it moving around or whatever. But it is a good idea. If you do have a bigger piece of wood, you do want to bring the tailstock up. To me, it's just, right now, it's just going to be a little inconvenient. All right, put it in the chuck and tighten it. All right, how many people, show of hands, how many people have ever been to a wood turning demonstration where the turner put the piece in the chuck and tightened it only in one hole? Nobody. I don't know why that is. Every single demonstration I've ever seen, they tighten one hole, then they turn around, they tighten the next hole, then they turn it around, then they tighten the next hole, then they turn it around. And you're saying, man, there's got to be like 50 holes in this chuck. But there aren't 50 holes. There's only 2. This has 2 holes. But it's one of those things. It's like the wood turning gods have to be appeased by you doing hole after hole, tightening it. I don't know. It's just one of those mysteries, one of those things, yeah. I was talking to Frank earlier today. My job in real life is a computer programmer, and oftentimes we have to learn new languages. We buy a book, we start reading a book, and every single book that's teaching you a programming language, the very first program in that book prints out "Hello World" to the screen. Every program. So it's kind of like the same thing. It's like everybody has to do like a "Hello World," and every wood turner has to tighten like every hole. It's just one of those funny things about being people. All right, so back to the Ellsworth gouge. Doing okay. All right. You can't really see the shape of the piece. If you could see the shape of the piece, you would see that it's not really shaped the way I want it to be. So we're going to start paying attention now to the shape. So now I'm trying to get that upright, kind of broken egg, elegant shape. All right. All right. And so some people are afraid of speed. If you've ever watched Jimmy Clues demonstrate, you're afraid of speed. You don't need to turn it as fast as Jimmy Clues does, but when you're doing these interrupted cuts where there's air, wood, it makes the wood come around a lot faster when the RPMs are higher. So I will turn it up a little bit higher just to get this cut done. All right. And so what I'm going to start doing, I'm going to start using the tool rest as a guide to shape the piece. So in essence, I'm really going for almost like a straight line. Wood turners most often preach about curves. This curve, that curve, do this curve, no flats on the curve, this curve, everything's curve. Well, it turns out when there's an interrupted line, so it's a round object, but the wood at this point is higher than that point, so your eye sees this over here, but there's a void here. So your eye really it's really challenging to the eye to visually pick up what's going on. And just in the area where the bark is, to me, in my experience, it's better to have more of a straight line and less of a curve than having a very accentuated curve. Now that's my opinion. That's not the law, not the fact, or hopefully it's the fact, but you may not agree with me. But so that's my way of doing these. I try to make them pretty straight where the bark is, and then I do the curve below that. So again, we're cutting in what's technically the wrong direction, and we're trying to help that bark to stay on the wood. And now I'll turn around and I'll complete the cut, and I'll go in the correct direction. So this is more of the slicing cut. The more you drop the handle, the more it's going to slice the wood, but the less wood you're going to remove. And to me, this is where it starts to get really fun. I really want the shape, the outside shape of the piece to define what you see as the piece. And so the better I can make that shape, to me, the better the piece will be. All right. I'm going to switch to a spindle gouge, and I found that most of the time you can get a little bit cleaner cut in this area, and you can get into a tighter area because the chuck is in the way. And I try to bring this gouge in there with the 60-degree bevel on it. It tends to want to hit the chuck jaws. And so I found that a spindle gouge will get in there a little bit tighter and make a little bit cleaner cut. Okay, I'm going to stop there. The bigger these get, the more you want to do them in stages. So I don't want to reduce the diameter of the wood here so much that there's not enough mass of wood to support what's going on up here. This piece is small enough that I could kind of get away with a smaller base at this point of the turning. But when they're bigger, you actually want to leave a little bit of mass of wood here and then come back and finish that part later. Everybody follow that? I know it's kind of, yeah, okay, great. All right, so we're starting to look nice. So I'm gonna show you 2 different ways to do the same thing. So the first way is the shear scraping cut with the bowl gouge. So to do the shear scraping cut with the bowl gouge, I have to do the handle almost straight up and down. I have to kind of stand with my legs cocked over here and my head over here, and I have to get the tool on the tool rest to anchor it, and I ease it into the wood, and I can go back and forth in both directions. And I get these fine, wispy, hair-like shavings that float in the air. So I'm making a really nice, really fine cut, and it's leaving a pretty nice surface on the wood. So that's method number 1. Method number 2 is to take another tool, a different tool, and I call this the dedicated shear scraping tool. This was a different shape when I bought it, and I put the bevel here. The way it cuts is there's a burr off the grinder on the top edge. Now, I've seen some people take away the grinder burr with a stone and then do like a razor burr with a tool or a burnishing tool or some other kind of tool. I find that what you get off the grinder is usually pretty good. So that's what I'm going to go with now. And this cut, I mean, we're refining the piece now. So we're trying to swap turning time with sanding time. So the better I can turn it at this point, the less sanding I'll have to do later. And this wood is still wet enough that if I give it a good spritz of water, then it's going to take some of that water in. It's going to swell the fibers a little bit. It's going to help lubricate the cut, and I'll end up with a finer surface. If this wood was kind of bone dry, spraying water on it is really not going to help that much. So you kind of have to play it by ear. So now I can stand with my feet kind of shoulder width apart where I can balance my body, move back and forth. I'm going to put the tool on the rest at sort of a 45-degree angle, and I'm going to bring in the cutting surface. And again, I can kind of go back and forth. But to me, trying to do this cut with the bowl gouge is just a little bit more difficult. This cut is not really intended to remove a lot of wood. So you kind of heard it kind of going chatter, 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 chatter. So I got a little bit aggressive with the tool. And again, I'm going to line up the tool rest. So I'm using the tool rest as a guide. So think of like your tool that you put, think of like a machinist where you've got one handle that you're turning that's moving a cutter in that direction, and another handle that you're turning and that's moving it in this direction. So this is the cutter, and I'm turning the handle, sliding the cutter down the tool rest. That's what I'm visualizing in my head to make that cut. Right. Here we go. Yeah. I'm looking over here on the horizon to see the shape that I'm turning. And I can actually turn it around and go in the other direction. Which does a little bit run the risk of the bark, but we've already kind of determined we're not going to save the bark. All right, we'll stop and we'll see. All right, so there's a little bit of tear out right through here. So there's the end grain, and there's just beyond the end grain. And that's one area where you get tear out. Then if you turn it end for end, and you look on the other side of the piece, the end grain and just beyond the end grain, and you get a little bit more tear out. So it just turns out that the way the fibers are oriented, there's nothing to support those fibers. And even, we were taking very, very fine cuts, but there's, like I said, there's nothing to support the fibers. So you'll get a little bit of tear out. Some woods are worse than others. Some woods you don't really notice it that much. This is not horrible. This is not beyond anything that could be sanded away. So we're good here. All right. So at this point, I'm satisfied with I'm going to make one more cut, and then I'll be satisfied with the quality of the cut. There's one little spot where there's like just a little click of a tear out. But again, we're exchanging turning time for sanding time. So we'll do our best cut that we could possibly make. Come back in this direction. All right, and we're going to call that good, because otherwise you'll fall asleep watching me do this. So this pencil line here represents, from the pencil line up, is the outside surface is as good as I can get it right now, today. From that pencil line down, then we can come back to it and we can address it later with the turning. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start hollowing. Again, back to the Ellsworth grind tool. This here. All right. So when I start hollowing, I want to really make sure that I'm going to be cutting right on the center line when the handle is horizontal. Don't want to hit that. You notice this is a homemade handle. And this is a nice store-bought handle, but both of these handles are pretty long. And you think of like jacking up a car. If I had the old car jacks where you had to jack them like that, I wouldn't hold the handle here and jack the car up. I'd hold it back here. It gives me much more torque. Well, it turns out, when you're turning with a longer handle, you're going to get that much more torque. All right. So we're cutting right on the center line. We're going to start. When you're doing a salad bowl or a flat rim bowl, you make a little bowl inside the big bowl, and then you make it a little bit bigger, and you make it a little bit bigger and bigger and bigger. We're going to do that to a point, but then we're going to stop. And I'm only going to go down maybe like 1.5 inches or so at this point, and do it in stages. So this is more of the roughing cut like we were doing earlier. All right. The farther and farther you hang off the tool rest, the more torque you're finding. So some of that was happening earlier is because I'm hanging like 3 inches off the tool rest with the tool. So I'm going to move the rest around a little bit, start to angle it kind of into the interior of the bowl. Make sure it spins without hitting. point where I'm going to stop. So one hallmark of a natural edge bowl is you want the rim to be the same thickness all the way around. And the way you achieve that is to have consistent wall thickness. So again, back to that point where I was making the outside surface straight where the bark is, that's going to help me to maintain a consistent wall thickness, and thus I'll have an even rim thickness. If I vary the thickness as I go down the piece, then it's going to get wider or smaller, and then that's really not very pleasing to the eye. It's also a good idea to practice your finishing cuts a little bit. This is one of Frank's tools, but it's got really kind of a nice bevel angle, and I think I'm going to be able to do a really nice finishing cut with it. So I'm going to do a little practice. It's a good idea to practice. I was telling Frank earlier, I still do play trumpet, but at one point I had ambitions of doing, music professionally. And it kind of turned out that I didn't really like to practice all that much. So it's hard to be a professional musician if you don't like to practice. But it's a good idea, especially if you're using a tool you haven't used before. While you have a little bit of extra thickness here, just do a little practice cut. And so we're going to do this in a minute for real, but for now, we're going to do sort of a practice finishing cut. And the way you do that is you find the area where it's going to cut. So here, we're just rubbing the bevel. So I have to keep moving the handle away until it starts to cut. Now it's starting to cut. So now I want to keep that same orientation, slide the tool back, and then push it into the wood and have it cut. All right, and I lost the cut halfway through. Okay, so that's my practice finishing cut. And the better you can do this cut, the more sanding you're going to save yourself later. Because every time you move, every time you bobble, there's going to be a little indentation in the wood that you're going to have to sand away. And that actually was a really nice cut from here to here. So what I'm going to do now is make a couple of more cuts with this tool and then make the finishing cut with this tool. And this is not a sweatback grind. This is more almost like what you'd see on a spindle gouge. All right. So this gets to be the point where you either want to sit on the lathe or you want to get a short bed lathe. The more you do these, you have to kind of learn your tendencies. I know for a fact that my tendency is to have a really nice even wall thickness just beyond where the bark is, and then I tend to get a little bit thinner. And if you're doing a really thin piece to begin with, if you got one area where you get thinner, then you end up with a hole. And that's not good. You never want to make the inside bigger than the outside. That's the one absolute of wood turning that nobody will argue with you that you can do. You absolutely cannot make the inside bigger than the outside. That you can take to the bank. All right. All right. So I may have to switch to the other tool rest because this is kind of short. We'll see what we can do here. All right. They make a tool rest that's kind of straight and then curved on the end. Those kind of work. If you can kind of finagle it around, those tend to work well for these type pieces, especially if you're doing bigger ones. So it spins, get it in there, and make a cut. I like to try, I think of like glass when I'm turning these. Glass has a thickness. I mean, anytime you've broken a glass and dropped it on the floor, you see that the shards are, they have a thickness to them. So it's not like super, super thin, but so I want to go maybe like a 1/8, maybe 3/16 of an inch final thickness here. This bark is not going to stay on, so I'm just going to get rid of it because you will appreciate that more than me. So I'm going to make one more cut with this one, then I'm going to make my finishing cut with the other tool. And this is the point where you want to breathe. You want to get your body in the position where you can make a very flowing, nice, easy cut. Don't forget to breathe. Breathing is good. All right, that's that cut. That's pretty good. Okay, so now we're going to come back, and this is going to be the finishing cut. So we're going to get everything positioned. Move it over a little bit. Yeah. All right. It's good if you can see, if you have like some light color thing you can put back here that helps you see a little bit better. Get your glass nice and clean. Get your body in a position where you can stand and move. All right, again, so bring it in here, find where it's going to cut. That's where it's going to cut. Bring it out here. And go. That's pretty good. So nice, consistent wall thickness. I got a little bit of fraying from some of the leftover bark. That's what those hairs are. That's not actually wood. That's just some of the underlying layer of bark. Pretty clean cut. All right. And that could be easily sanded. All right. I kind of hesitate to try to show you a different technique. That takes some skill, that takes some practice, that takes some breathing. Less effective is this negative rake scraper because it'll tend to do a little bit of tear out. But I do want to at least show you how that works. Okay, so I can bring the negative rake scraper in here. And again, hold it horizontal, just bring it into the wood. And it's another one of those tools that that uses the burr to cut. And I can come in and I can clean up. You may have noticed when I very first started that cut, I didn't quite get it started well. So that's going to leave some marks. So I can come back with this tool and clean it up. We'll use this tool a little bit later, but that's how it works. As we go deep, it's more effective, sort of in the 2/3 of the bottom. It's pretty effective across the bottom and then up to 2/3. It's not as effective on the sidewalls, but you can use it. And if you're really chicken or not so confident about your tool usage, you can even cut the wings with it. All right, any questions on that? We're all still here. Everybody except for a couple people are awake. All right, that's good. I always lose one, at least one. Frank had a nap today. Frank is good to go. All right. So we are cool. So on the inside, I'm almost at my pencil line. So now what I want to do on the inside, I just want to complete that curve. I'll go back to the Ellsworth grind. Lower the rest a little bit. We're going 10 after 8. 20 more minutes, right? Okay. Good. Plenty of time. All right. Yeah, when you're doing the inside, you got to get the tool rest height right, or you just can't really make the cut. I think we're going to have to switch. I was trying to avoid using that ginormous rest over here, but we're going to have to switch at this point. Nope, we're not going to switch. All right. All right, we'll make do. That was the other thing we were going to get.
That's right.
Yeah,
On the list.
it was on the list.
Where's the list?
The list that neither one of us actually made. We got back to Frank's house and I said, I think I made a list on my phone. And I looked on my phone and there was no list. And Frank's like, well, I think I made a list on my phone. And there was no list on his phone. So we are both technology challenged with our list. We may get really interesting in a minute. All right. Spins, turn it on, cut. That's better. You always end up with this little nub in the center. And it just turns out that a little bit of patience, a little slowing down, determination, and you can cut through the nub. Something you don't want to hurry through. So now I'm thinking about the bottom side of the egg. Yeah, the bottom side of the egg. It could have been the small side of the egg, but this is going to be the bottom side of the egg. So we're pretty good here. So now I'm going to come back to the cut where I finished earlier, and I'm just going to continue that cut down. I'm not such a stickler. So you really want consistent, even wall thickness where the natural edge, bark edge is, because what I explained earlier, you don't want it to vary in thickness. Once you get past that, I feel like it's okay to get a little bit thicker. It's going to give your piece a little bit of weight in the bottom. When you pick it up, it'll have a little bit of heft. You don't want it to be clunky though. So letting it go a little bit thicker as it goes toward the bottom, in my opinion, is okay. And so that's what we're going to do here. And that's going to give us the freedom to shape the outside as well. All right. That's a good cut with the Ellsworth gouge, and now I'm going to go back to the Frank gouge, Frank's cool special gouge here that he let me use today. I don't know what name it is. What do you call this, Frank? You have a name for it?
What?
You have a name for this? What do you call it? I mean, it's almost like
It's a U-shaped, half-inch U-shaped bowl gouge.
half-inch U-shaped bowl gouge. That's what Frank calls it. That's what we're going to call it. All right, so we're going to make the cut. And that's all we can do with that. All right, we're doing good there. I'm checking the thickness with my fingers. You can also use a tool. I like to use this thing right here, because it's cool because you can open it. And it has a screw here where you can set it for a certain thickness. and then it'll open when it gets thicker, but it goes back to that thickness. So you can start it out here, and then you push it down, and you can see where my pencil line is where it starts to hit. So that's where it starts to get thicker, okay? Which is what I want. All right. I can't make any more cuts with this. Give me one cut with this. All right. All right, right about there. Not like that. I'm very challenged with this rest now. All right, we're gonna make the best cut we can with this rest. If I could use the other rest, I could get it inside the bowl a little bit more. Okay, so that's the best I could do with this tool. So the negative rake scraper is going to come to the rescue for us, and we're going to clean up that bottom part of the cut up into the sidewall. Make a couple of cuts here. It's always a challenge when you're turning for an audience. I mean, I want to turn a nice piece, but I don't want to bore you to death. And so I'm not going to spend the same amount of time turning this that I would, if I were at home in my own workspace. All right, that's pretty good. We're getting a little bit of tear out from this right across the bottom of the piece, but that's okay.
Would it help to wet that? Outside?
It turns out with the negative rake scraper, wetting it doesn't really help a lot. I mean, it might help a little bit. I could try it.
I'm just curious if it would.
I normally don't do it with the negative rake scraper. It's more like when you're doing like a shearing cut, a slicing cut, that's going to help. But we'll try it. Hey, it might help. We'll see. It didn't help. Nah, not really. All right. So that's pretty good. I need to know how deep I've gone at this point. And again, keep it simple. Just take a pencil, stick it in the bottom, make sure it comes straight out. I've got my rest perpendicular, so I'll move that over here. And I am right halfway through my secondary tenon is where I've hollowed 2, and that's good. I'm happy about that. I'm getting a little bit thicker, a little thicker in the base than I would prefer, but good enough that we can go ahead and move on, because we're getting kind of close. We got 10 minutes, so we're doing good. Doing good, 10 minutes, doing good. All right. So I'm going to do a little more shaping on the outside. So if this were a bigger piece, I would have left like a big mass of wood here, and I'd come back and I'd finish shaping it. Here we have less wood to work with. So and this is where we start thinking about this thing here, so we want that kind of the base diameter compared to the outside diameter. So if the whole diameter of the piece is here, then we would want the base to be that diameter here. Or probably this one. That one. No, probably this one. So this is kind of ideas you can start thinking, 2/3, 1/3, what's pleasing to the eye. If it looks good to your eye, then it's usually pretty good. That's pretty good, and then I'll clean it up with my shear scraping tool. With some spritz. Stop it. Yeah, it's not bad. That is not bad. So, all right. All right, any questions? No. All right, so the final step is to make a jam chuck. So I made this earlier, magic of television, all that jive. I've just got a little scrap block of wood. I'm gonna put that scrap block of wood in the dark, if it fits. It may not fit. It fits. All right. Good. Tighten both holes. Wouldn't that be funny if I didn't tighten that hole? After I made such an ordeal of tightening the holes. All right, we're gonna true this up just to make sure. All right, so it's running out a little bit. You want it to have a ring, an outside ring to sit on. So like, think of like a triangle, so you have 2 points of the triangle, and then the center point. Take some paper towels. And a tailstock. You cannot do this step without the tailstock. It's another absolute of wood turning. We're in all kinds of absolutes today. You cannot do this step without the tailstock. Yeah. So put the paper towel in there. The reason I put the paper towel in there is if you get any kind of slippage, you'll get a ring or a little burn mark or something unpleasant that's very difficult to sand away in the bottom of your piece. Just have to tighten this in. All right, so hopefully this runs true. Oh, it does. That's good. All right, so if you remember, when I made that mark, half of the secondary tenon was where I hollowed to, and I turned that away. So what I want to do really is just take this piece, take the tenon away, and then shape the base, and that will be where I want the bottom of the piece to end up. So I know where I've hollowed to. You don't know where I've hollowed to, but you have to trust me. Or we make a funnel. If I make a funnel, you'll probably blame it on me, right? All right, so that's running true, which is good. A lot of times it doesn't. All right, so we're just gonna do all the cuts we did earlier. Take that down to kind of a small-ish nub. Blend this in. And this is really where I'm thinking about the egg and the shape of an egg. So blend that in. All right. And it's thick enough that I am 99% confident that this will not have a hole in the bottom. How many of you have a tool with Michael Hoslick birds on the handle? Michael Hoslick was at the Florida Wood Turning Symposium in February, And I wrangled him up and I said, hey, Mike, will you put some of your birds on my handle for me? Because this used to be his tool. He came and he did a demo for our club. You know, he's from Canada, right? So he brings his tool with him, but he doesn't like to take things home. So he's like, anybody want this tool? Want to buy this tool? And so I did. And years later, as I went back to him, I said, Mike, this used to be your tool, so can you put some of your birds on the handle I made? And he did. And I was very happy, because Mike is a cool guy. So sometimes when I do these and I want to let it dry a little bit, because there's a little bit of moisture left in this wood, I'll leave a little nub on it like this and just kind of leave this off to dry, and then that way I can put it back on the lathe, not to return, but to do sanding. So I have a lot of these pieces that are in this state at home, waiting for me to get back to them, to sand them and then take the nub off. But it's, you know, there's enough nub on there that I can get it on the lathe and I can do all my sanding stuff. Unfortunately, you kind of have to hold it to do the sanding on the inside, but it's not that bad. Surprisingly not that bad, especially if you have like a pneumatic sander. You can just kind of hold it and go, you know, sand the inside. All right, so, but we're not gonna do that now. I'm gonna go ahead and take the nub completely off. So I want to undercut the base a little bit so it'll sit flat on the table. So that's what this cut is. I used to cut all the way through these during a demo, and it was kind of cool to watch it. Just cut all the way through. I don't do that anymore. All right. That's really... All right, so a little bit of this shear scraping tool on the bottom. You don't really want to go much above. I'm very, very tempted at this point to come up in this area and kind of touch up the shape, but you really, really, really don't want to do that because it's already moved and warped, and bad things can happen, and you end up like causing more problems in your sawing. So you just kind of have to live with it. And I've got a little Japanese saw at home that I would saw through this with, but I didn't bring it with me. So at this point, I'll just use my handy dandy flex cut carving jack. These things are really cool. They have 6 blades, and one side they're all curved, and the other side they're all straight. So there's a little V-gouge, a little knife blade, and a little chisel, and on this side there's a little U-gouge and a little straight U-gouge, side U-gouge, and then like a spoon carving kind of gouge. It's a really cool tool. This is the right-handed version. They sell a left-handed version, which I do not own, unfortunately. But it's a really cool carving tool. So hopefully I can cut through enough of this. Like I said, normally I would it's not gonna work. So anyway, normally I would saw off the nub and then I would come back with my carving tool and clean it up. Oh, okay, here we go.
That was in the way.
All right, so minus getting rid of the nub, this is pretty much the finished piece. And again, it's a little thicker on the base than my preference would be, so don't judge me harshly against that. But this is pretty much the way I do them. And I think this is kind of a nice piece. It's got some translucence to it. It's got some nice undulations in the natural bark edge area. So anybody have any questions? Oh, you're going to clap. Yay, thank you. Thank you very much. We'll pass it around. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Or if not, it's 8:32, so I did pretty good on time.
Okay,
All right.
you're on. Tom's on.
All right. That was fun.
That's it. No more taking notes. We're not taking notes anymore.